Let me come to Irene then. And Irene, one of the, and we heard Ignacio talk about this as well, and I know that the two of you worked on this as well, in terms of bringing a very special focus of youth and children kind of thing into this GCM discussion, and even had probably one of the most organized sectoral kind of papers in this, a very good strategy that played out, which went, that you all got a lot into the GCM as well from that perspective. You want to share your thoughts then on Objective 7, and where you are currently looking at how it is playing out?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, William, and everyone for this invitation. This is the first time that UNICEF participates in this series, so I would like to start by a few general thoughts about what the Global Compact for Migration means for children and young people, and then I will go into Objective 7, if that's okay. First of all, by making child sensitivity one of the 10 guiding principles of the Compact, a principle that cuts across all of the 23 objectives, governments have recognized that children are central to migration management. So for the first time, children are not a footnote and they're not an afterthought. They're not relegated to a separate objective, and they're not only seen through the lens of vulnerability. Instead, in the Compact, governments acknowledge that they must pay attention to children and their rights, not only because they need protection, but because laws, policies, and practices that ignore children are really ineffective. When children fall through the cracks, migration systems fail. The key ask of the Compact is rooted in the CRC, in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's really very simple. Treat every migrant child as a child first, so that migration can be a positive and an empowering experience for all children. Not only children who migrate, but also children who stay behind in countries of origin, undocumented children in countries of destination, etc. All of the spectrum of how migration affects children is included in the Compact. So in other words, the Compact asks to focus on potential instead of vulnerability, and on inclusion instead of marginalization. At least that's how we are seeing it. And this is also why I cannot focus only on Objective 7 today, and why I don't want to talk about how migrant children are vulnerable. This core ask of the Compact is also crucial because it really identifies rightly what's at the core of so many migration management practices that put children at risk, that put children in so-called vulnerable situations. And in the end, if you look at it, it's nothing else than discrimination. Discrimination explains why migrant children don't access national systems and end up in parallel structures under the care of immigration authorities instead of child protection authorities. Discrimination also explains why immigration detention is justified as a protective measure for children, even if detaining children to protect them would never be acceptable for national children in any country. And discrimination explains why most states don't grant undocumented migrant children the level of healthcare that they afford to national children. This call to non-discrimination in the Compact is not abstract, which is really good and was really welcomed by us. It is unpacked in many concrete actions under each objective of the GCM. And these actions are all interlinked, and of course, are not just the actions where children are explicitly mentioned. So actually, if you were to do a word search for child, you would miss the actions that are most relevant to children and to address their vulnerability. So if we take Objective 7, because that's the focus of our webinar today, but we could take any other objective, we see that actions E and F, for example, focus on best interest procedures, the role of child protection authorities, safeguards for unaccompanied children, etc. Very concrete child protection issues. So these are all policy areas where there was already a relatively solid political consensus before the Compact was adopted. And these are measures that have momentum behind them and have had momentum behind them for a while. And I would love to go into details in terms of promising practices that we see in all regions regarding these practices. But I will continue, and I'll get back to that in my second round if there is time for that or interest in that. I will already mention, for example, that the recently adopted EU Pact on Migration and Asylum has a section on children that has all of the right language in terms of safeguards, in terms of protection, procedures, best interests, etc. Now, what about the actions in Objective 7 that do not mention children, such as the actions A or H or I? These actions call for reviewing policies that exacerbate vulnerabilities, and the most important of all, for establishing pathways to regular status. And I really cannot think of two actions that would be more urgent to protect migrant children in vulnerable situations for real and in the long term. But here, of course, the picture of state practices is not so encouraging, and also consensus around them is also not so solid, especially because some governments see increasing vulnerability as an explicit goal of their migration policy, explicit or implicit, because they hope that it will act as a deterrent. Despite that, we are seeing some progress in these areas, partly also because of the COVID context. Now, I will go back in a second to the trends we are seeing during the COVID pandemic, but first I want to outline quickly what UNICEF has been doing since the compact was adopted to turn vulnerability into opportunity for migrant children, to reply, William, to your question in your introductory remarks. So this is where we see the hope. In terms of the what, we're focusing on 4 thematic priorities. One is ending child migration detention. The second is promoting child-sensitive returns and reintegration. The third is ensuring inclusion of migrant children in national and local systems and services, of course, regardless of status. And the fourth is strengthening cooperation of child protection actors across borders. Now, in terms of how we're doing this, we are mainly following 2 strategies. The first, as you were mentioning, is bringing children and young people to the table as partners. We are committed to do nothing about them without them, and to include new voices in the conversation. So we are investing in interpretation, in facilitation, in skills development, and we're also systematically connecting young partners, both those that are engaged in UN global conversations and working at the grassroots level, so both levels, with the day-to-day work of our offices all across the world in all regions, and also with the work of other UN entities and other actors. And maybe here I wanna say a disclaimer that when I say children and young people, I'm talking about local activists, community leaders, young researchers, entrepreneurs, frontline workers, national and local government officials, etc. These youth have a connection to migration that is both personal and professional. And of course, we want to co-design programs with them. We don't want to invite them to tell their challenging migration story at a panel discussion at risk of re-traumatizing them. That's not what we're talking about. I will just skip the concrete examples of progress in terms of youth engagement and participation. I will just mention that we see the regional reviews of the compact that are coming in the coming months as a real crucial opportunity to establish children and youth as key actors who will keep governments accountable. And this is not only as part of civil society, but also as part of government delegations, and not only as participants in stakeholder consultations, but also as speakers along with governments. Now, moving to our second strategy or way of working, we have focused on creating spaces for peer learning among governments and other actors on 2 key issues: alternatives to detention and returns and reintegration. And these are 2 core migration management issues that we see as the 2 sides of the coin of the COVID pandemic. Regarding detention, we think that the current crisis presents a tiny window of opportunity to show how migration governance without detention looks like in practice, because alternatives to detention have emerged as a viable solution to mitigate public health concerns, but also to protect the rights of migrants and give them access to services. And on the contrary, we see how states are using the pandemic to step up forced returns of migrants without due process, using this opportunity to stigmatize migrants even more and to close borders. So some examples of our work towards ending child migration detention, I will just mention for the sake of time that we have partnered with the International Detention Coalition to convene a global multi-stakeholder platform to support states in addressing the practical challenges they face when putting in place alternatives to detention. So we had meetings in all regions with the exception of Europe since the compact was adopted. And we're really looking at this as an open space for government experts to discuss common challenges, share progress, exchange positive and not so positive practices, and also to build the capacity of experts through meetings and through sites visits. Now, on returns, to conclude, we are planning to bring governments together also across migration corridors to mitigate some of the most worrying trends that we're seeing with forced returns in the context of COVID, because here the numbers are really staggering. For example, since March, the US has expelled over 150,000 asylum seekers and migrants, including 8,800 unaccompanied children, who have been sent back without due process and without consideration of their best interests, in many cases to violent conditions that threaten their life in Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. In Africa, 40,000 children have been returned to West Africa and Central Africa, including 12,000 to Niger only. Over 1,500 have been returned from Iran to Afghanistan. And only until August, we had at least 1,600 migrant children returned to Ethiopia, mainly from the Gulf. So just to conclude, my 3 key takeaways for you to put children and youth at the core of the GCM implementation would be: first, partner with migrant children and youth and look at them through the lens of vulnerability. Second, bring governments together to learn from each other. And the more sensitive, political, and divisive is the issue, the more potential there is for engaging constructively and shifting the dial on some issues, as we have seen or are starting to see on the issue of immigration detention. And third, we see the pandemic as creating opportunities to make progress on some GCM objectives. And at the same time, is providing governments with good cover to backslide even on some of their most basic commitments in the GCM, such as non-refoulement, as Ignacio was saying. So this means that we have to seize this opportunity to reimagine some migration management practices where we can, but also to doing risk mitigation and holding the line on other core issues. So it is really not only about building back better and reimagining, but about holding the line and standing up for some of the core values and the core vision of the GCM. I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks a lot. And of course, happy to share examples, more materials, information, promising, not so promising practices, concrete ideas in terms of UNICEF's work, etc. Over.
No, thanks, Irene, and for sharing a lot of the work that you all have been doing as UNICEF. But also thanks for recognize and the contradiction that we see in our daily lives, and this is so evident in the UN system kind of thing that we have. The most ratified human rights convention will be the rights of the child kind of thing. Who wouldn't, which country would dare not to ratify the rights of the child convention, in the sense, because children are children and we recognize them as our future of society, future of community, future of families. Our very future as a race hangs on our children kind of thing. And yet we know, and we've seen this, we've got friends now on this call from the Latin American region, from the Central American region. We've seen over the years, and we see this continually till today, that the most advanced developed countries in the world don't treat migrant children as children of the future. We see that, we hear stories every day from the most developed countries of the world, kind of taking these kind of responses. So how much of this speak, which comes in documents, and yes, we have this and a lot of this kind of UN speak language kind of thing, which all of us can subscribe to, because of the fear of not subscribing to it puts us in this situation where, okay, and how much of it could be something what Patrick was saying, like the notion, the realization of inclusion, where migrant children would be seen as our children. What do we have against children as host countries, as developed countries, as countries that host welcome migrant workers, asylum seekers, refugee populations, whatever you might have it kind of thing in terms of mobile populations? What prevents society from recognizing these children as the future of humanity, and therefore, at least within this category of not putting up those barriers, not putting up the kind of responses that we have? Aside, because I don't think these kind of, I'm wondering if these policy kind of documents and frameworks and things like that, alternatives to detention, how many children do they affect? Like, how many children in detention or caught up in those situations does an alternative to detention program really have an impact on? And how many children will continue to remain in that situation of detention for years and live the trauma of that? How do we assess our progress that we are making in this regard? This is something I think we must have I think this conversation on children has to go to a much more deeper kind of conversation, from documents to a real realization of children, at least in children, whether migrant or nationals or citizens, or don't fall within any of those categories. They should just be seen as children. And this is something I'm wondering if when you come back on to see of if there is work that UNICEF is looking at in how to change that social environment kind of thing, it might be useful.